American Foundation, John Bellinger from Arnold and Porter and the Council on Foreign Relations, and Sahar Aziz of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Thank you all for joining us. And I didn't put the full title I wanted to on this particular panel. Recently, I know some of you in the audience participated in the Washington Ideas Forum that was sponsored by the Atlantic Monthly, the Newseum, and the Aspen Institute, and I had the honor of being one of the co-producers of this meeting. We had a meeting with Mike McConnell, the former Director of National Intelligence. Jane Harman participated in this, Anne Marie Slaughter, who heads policy planning at the State Department, several congressmen, Senator Whitehouse. And it was a very, very interesting roundtable, the recording of which is actually online at the Atlantic Monthly website. But in it, we had a discussion which Jane Harman initiated, and Anne Marie Slaughter and others jumped on, where she said, it's basically not just the fog of war, it's the fog of law. And I'm mentioning this cautiously because John Bellinger, who can now go behind, on his way to the restroom and write an op-ed using that. I'm doing one right now with Jane Harman on that subject. But it is essentially the fog of law in dealing with a very different kind of warfare, where I think many people have thought that the legal apparatus that we used to have in some ways this is debatable, but doesn't in fact give us what we need. And during a controversial, and provocative period of time in responding to this, a set of legal environments were created. I call them Kafkaesque, but they're sort of gray zones. And my friend John Bellinger, who I mentioned with Arnold Porter, during the Bush administration, was one of the key, and I don't want to say moments of principle, but periods of principle in the Bush administration, who fought tenaciously inside the Bush administration over this question about the fog of law. And he and other colleagues did that as well. Of course, John Bellinger was the senior legal advisor through the National Security Council to the President of the United States and to the National Security Advisor. He was the legal advisor at the State Department when Secretary Rice was there at the State Department, served the entire 8 years in the Bush administration. We worked together in the Senate many years ago when he was with the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. We were buddies back then, both involved as term members in the Council on Foreign Relations and went rafting down German rivers at the time. But we've been friends for a long time, and I've had enormous respect for John Bellinger, particularly in the well-reported battles that he had with David Addington and others, which he won't talk about, but I need to put on the docket. We also have Sahar Aziz, as an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown Law Center, as a legal fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. She previously served as senior policy advisor in the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It's great to have her with us, I think, for the first time at a New American Foundation. And then we have, the icon and terrorist tracker himself, the guy who knows more about Osama bin Laden than anyone else, I think, other than Osama, and that's Peter Bergen, of course. Peter received a really terrific tribute from Thomas Kean, for those of you who were here, when he referred to the person who had highly informed the 9/11 Commission. He paid tribute to the work that Peter had done. Peter is also a print and television journalist. Whenever there's a new tape, you will see him with Wolf Blitzer and all sorts of folks. Christian Amanpour, who used to be with CNN, but all of his buddies on CNN. Peter Bergen is probably the best-known commenter on terrorism out there. He's the author of Holy War, Inc., Inside the Secret World of Osama bin Laden. Also, the Osama bin Laden I Know, an oral history of al-Qaeda's leader. And I don't have it in front of me, but I know he's about to release yet another book that hopefully he will share with us. And he co-directs New America's Counterterrorism Strategy Program at the New America Foundation. So it's a great pleasure. And the order we're going to do this, I'm going to ask John to speak first, and he'll join us at the podium here, and then have Sahar, and then I'll ask Peter, rather than the lawyers chasing folks, I'm going to have the Peter chasing the lawyers. So, John Bellinger.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you for putting together this conference. I think at an important time like this, I suspect that I missed your introduction this morning, but I suspect that's why you're doing it, because we are at the halfway mark in the Obama administration, just on the eve of the election, 2 years through, and we're now looking at what might change in the next couple of years. And that's what I'd like to talk about with respect to counterterrorism policies, both looking backwards and looking forwards. President, then candidate Obama, of course, campaigned both domestically and to the extent that a candidate can campaign internationally, he did, on reversing the Bush administration's counterterrorism excesses and restoring the U.S. image in the world. So looking over the last 2 years, I think we have all seen some major changes. Most of those major changes came on the second day of the president's term with respect to the 3 executive orders that he issued on his second day, ordering the closure of Guantanamo within 1 year, the end of the highly controversial CIA program, and a review of all policies and detention programs to see what ought to be changed. That was, of course, met with huge acclaim internationally at the time, a huge sea change and expectation of momentous change. Essentially, that was the last time we really saw any momentous change. Since that time, there has really been more continuity than change in counterterrorism policies from the Bush administration through the Obama administration. And let me be clear, I guess, since some of you I know in the room and others I don't, when those executive orders came out, I publicly applauded them. These were some things that a number of us inside the Bush administration had been working, particularly in the second term of the Bush administration, for those changes. Since that time, though, much has stayed the same. The law of war paradigm, detaining people under the laws of war indefinitely without trial, to everyone's great surprise, particularly internationally, the extension of military commissions, the whole idea of a global war on terror. The administration has carefully dropped the term, which was disliked around the world, but the concept is really still there, the idea that the United States can use force essentially anywhere in the world against al-Qaeda, not just in Afghanistan. Quietly last summer, in the end of July, the Justice Department announced that the program of rendition would continue, but subject to certain safeguards. And of course, much debated now in Washington, drone strikes used somewhat sparingly before, we're now seeing 3 or 4 times a week in multiple countries around the world and kicking off a great debate about their legality. From my point of view as a lawyer, one of the most significant things that hasn't changed at all is the legal framework for dealing with terrorism and with detention in particular. You might look back at a terrific speech that President Obama gave at the Archives in May of 2009, in which he laid out in great detail against the backdrop of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence what his vision was going to be to correct some of these as he called them, hasty decisions that had been made by the Bush administration. And he said that he would clarify the legal rules, and in particular, he said that he would seek legislation to clarify those legal rules. He said, we'll work with Congress to develop an appropriate legal regime so that our efforts are consistent with our values and our Constitution. He's also repeatedly said that he is reaffirming the U.S. commitment to the Geneva Conventions. He got a terrific applause line at his own Nobel Prize acceptance speech a year ago when he said that. But with respect to the domestic legal framework and the international legal framework, nothing really has changed. We are still relying to hold all the people in Guantanamo and Afghanistan on a 10-year-old statute, the Authorization to Use Military Force Act, that says nothing at all about detention. With respect to the Geneva Conventions, nothing has really changed. We are the 3rd Geneva Convention on prisoners of war, the 4th Geneva Convention on protected persons. The President is not applying those. So why not? Why so little change? Part of it is that the new administration has found that dealing with non-state actors who attack you from beyond your borders, from ungoverned areas, that there really are some difficult new legal problems that the Bush administration wrestled with not very well, failed in numerous areas, but there really are some hard issues. These people do not fit neatly into our criminal laws that may not apply overseas and fit an extradition framework, nor do they fit neatly into the international legal regime of the Geneva Conventions. The other reason, of course, is just the tremendous political polarization that we have in this country on national security issues that has prevented the President from closing Guantanamo, from getting this legislation and from even having federal criminal trials. So after the midterms, will we see some change? I hope that we will. I hope that for about the last 6 to 9 months, the White House has essentially been caught in paralysis because they have not wanted to follow through on some of the commitments that the president made in his archive speech for fear of being accused of being soft on terrorism. So that's why we've not seen movement forward on federal criminal trials, on seeking of legislation. Starting after the election in that narrow window before the next election year, I would hope, and I assume this is really the purpose of your conference here, Steve, is that we will see moderates come together in the middle, that we will cease to see as much, well, we will continue to see it, but can we build a consensus in the middle of people who will move beyond the politicization of these national security issues to try to reach some sort of a consensus? In particular, to seek a uniform detention law so that people who we are holding over a long period of time have got some regularized framework and some clearer international rules, whether it's under the Geneva Convention or certain aspects of the Geneva Convention that are set out in what's called the Article or Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, but to have a clearer legal framework for the detention and prosecution of people going forward. With respect to federal criminal trials, my hope is going to be that we will see that at least the 9/11 planners will be tried in federal court, perhaps if it's not in New York City, on a more secure military base or a more secure city somewhere in New York. I am not one who believes that all people have to be tried in federal courts. I think military commissions can be used in certain circumstances. But with respect to the 9/11 planners, I hope that we will see the president move forward to hold those trials in federal court. Why don't I stop there? I would like to, during the question period, really begin to examine a little bit what kind of legislation that Congress could come together to try to clarify these rules after the election. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this very timely and informative conference. You'll have to excuse me, I lost my voice a few days ago, so bear with me as I stretch a little. So first, I just want to preface my comments by saying that although we probably disagree on some strategy and some tactics with regard to counterterrorism, especially as it relates to civil liberties, I think that there's one thing that we do all agree on, and that's that civil liberties and constitutional rights are paramount to our nation and to our personal lives and to the quality of our lives. The defense of America necessarily requires the defense of the Constitution. And today I want to focus on 3 key points. The first is that no group has a monopoly over terrorism, and terrorism does not discriminate in who its victims are. People of all creeds, races, and religions have been victims of terrorism and have perpetrated terrorism. And the September 11th attacks, insofar as the identity of the victims are concerned, was no exception. Hindus, Jews, Christians, and Muslims were also victims. The second point I want to make is there are no civil liberties for them and no civil liberties for us. There's just us. I know this is a very obvious point, but I feel compelled to state it because, as you have all probably seen in the media in the last couple of months, there has been an unabashedly vitriolic discourse and divisive discourse about Muslims in America. Much of it was connected to the community center in New York City, but it has proliferated into something that has caused me much concern and many of my colleagues, both within the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian community and outside, I think, across America. And the third point I want to make is that it's mainly a cautionary one, is that I personally have started to witness, and I think many in the audience have as well, a troubling set of events that are cause for concern that our constitutionally protected rights to dissent and to exercise our religious freedom are under siege. Specifically, anti-war and anti-death penalty groups seem to be infiltrated by government agents. U.S. citizens are being forcibly exiled from their country, from our country, and the FBI has just recently raided very well-known advocacy groups for no apparent reason but their oppositional speech. And as Justice Kennedy succinctly stated, speech critical of the exercise of the state's power lies at the very center of the First Amendment. So while no specific ethnic or religious group has a monopoly over terrorism, what I'm finding a bit troubling is this focus of homegrown terrorism only on terrorism committed by Muslims. And that's not to say that that type of terrorism is not dangerous and serious and warrants investigation and prosecution, but I think we have to be careful not to have a short-sighted, myopic view of terrorism, especially in light of the history of homegrown terrorism in America, which some would say goes as far back as the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, a University of Maryland study reported that as many state police agencies viewed neo-Nazis as posing a serious threat to their own state security as they did terrorism that could be committed by Muslims. And just recently, a Time magazine 6-month investigation found that recruiting, planning, training, and explicit calls for a shooting war are on the rise by militia groups that are heavily armed, trained in combat operations, and highly distrustful of the government, if not outright anti-government. So I'm just mentioning this to make a point that tends to be overlooked, is that if all we're focusing on is one particular group, we're going to get blindsided by other groups. And there is one specific case that I found baffling, and perhaps the audience can enlighten me during the question and answer period, or my co-panelists can, and that's the case of Joseph Stack, who essentially engaged in a suicide mission. He flew an airplane into a 4-story building in Austin, Texas, an IRS building. It had 190 offices, IRS employee offices. He killed an IRS employee who was also a veteran, and he seriously injured 13. He had long-standing grievances with the IRS, and in fact, in his suicide note, he declared, "I am finally ready to stop this insanity. Well, Mr. Big Brother IRS man, let's try something different. Take my pound of flesh and sleep well." I'm highlighting this case because there was a huge debate about whether or not what he did constituted terrorism. And to me, I thought it was an easy case. He had a political motive. He was trying to intimidate or coerce, or at least he was trying to shape government policy, which is one of the elements of domestic terrorism. And so then I asked myself, or it begs the question, had his name been Muhammad Ahmed, and had he been protesting the drone attacks abroad, but had engaged in exactly the same behavior and left the same suicide note, except focusing on a different policy that he was protesting, would there have been any question that he was a terrorist? No, and there shouldn't have been. That's terrorism. So my point is, terrorists who are Muslims are no exception to other terrorists, whose motives and grievances are essentially political, notwithstanding the nature of their rhetoric. The second point I want to make is that civil liberties protect all of us from undue infringement of our fundamental rights. If we allow those civil liberties to be infringed on one particular group, it will come back to haunt all of us. We are all part of the same political community. And the reason why this is important is because what's happened since 9/11 is that there has become this stereotype of the terrorist other. And at first it seemed that it was just a backlash. Okay, the first year or two, it's understandable, we're all panicked, we're hysterical, there was a very traumatic, horrible terrorist attack that happened. We're 9 years later and it hasn't gone away. So what is that stereotype? Essentially that Muslims are collectively disloyal, they are inherently violent, that they are collectively suspect, unless they individually prove otherwise. And that is not an abstract, I'm not just mentioning this as an abstract issue. In fact, if you look at a New York Police Department report that was issued in 2007, which has had a remarkable influence on not just the FBI, but on local and state police departments nationwide, this report drew very broad and faulty conclusions based on 5 case studies that essentially encourages policing activity on the basis of religious conduct that's engaged by millions of Muslims in America. For example, the report describes typical signatures of homegrown terrorism as giving up cigarettes, gambling, and urban hip-hop gangster clothes, so giving that up, wearing traditional Islamic clothing and growing a beard, becoming involved in social activism and community issues. Well, I guess I've got a problem. The doctrinally mandated prayer 5 times a day that millions of Muslims complete is also evidence of radicalization towards terrorism. So essentially a profile of the archetype archetype of terrorism is nothing short than designating converts to Islam, Orthodox practicing Muslims, and imams as suspects. This wrong correlation between religiosity and violence just reinforces that terrorist other stereotype. And unfortunately, this report was not some fringe report that just ended up on the side. It's actually been incorporated into many training programs and into many other reports. And ultimately, religious profiling is not effective. I mean, if you just want to take it from a purely practical standpoint, it's comparable to racial profiling. We had numerous debates over the 90s about racial profiling of African Americans, particularly in the inner city. Many studies have been made. So aside from the normative wrong that it doesn't work, because there's nothing about being a certain race or a certain religion or a certain ethnicity that is necessarily indicative of criminal activity. Now, this stereotype has also, so it's affected the way that law enforcement is being implemented, but it's also affected real people's daily lives, and it's transformed into palpable forms of discrimination. For example, when you have cases of Muslims who want religious accommodation, as they are rightfully deserve under Title VII, which has been around since 1964 as part of the Civil Rights Act, they're suddenly accused of being part of some ludicrous conspiracy of the Shariaization of America, which, and it's not a fringe theory is the problem. This is why I'm mentioning it here, is because it's actually started to gain ground, and in the last 2 or 3 months, we've seen it as almost part of the public discourse. The other way that it's played out is through the opposition of mosques nationwide. So it's not just about the Islamic Center in New York City, but what's happened is there's been a nationwide campaign to oppose the construction of Islamic centers. And they essentially are smearing all of these communities and claiming that they are engaging in stealth jihad and there is some illicit motive. And the paradox in these oppositions, I mean, aside from the fact that they arguably could violate the Religious Land Use and Inmate Protection Act, which, by the way, was led by an interfaith group in 2000, primarily of Christian evangelicals who were extremely upset that their houses of worship were being discriminated against in land use zoning. But in addition to that aspect of it is that these Islamic centers and all kinds of religious centers or community centers, whatever their religious background are, they serve a very important social service. They integrate communities, they have a lot of after-school programs, and they're essentially vital, I think, to the integration of new communities into this country. So there's a bit of a paradox in why there would be such an opposition to something that, in fact, is beneficial to this country, even if you want to say that it could theoretically counter terrorism by integrating people. Okay, I'm almost out of time. The last thing I just want to talk about are some of the recent developments that I think are highly problematic and should cause us some concern. First, over the past few years, with the most visible incident being in 2005 and 2006, the Maryland State Police engaged in covert infiltration and intelligence gathering of anti-war and anti-death penalty groups, up to at least 53 activists were put on terrorist watch lists, which then causes them to be stopped at airports. Some of them aren't able to get loans. They can get on the OFAC list. There are a lot of collateral consequences of being investigated for terrorism. And if you, in fact, have not engaged in terrorism, that is completely unwarranted collateral adverse consequences. The other problem is the no-fly list. The no-fly list is an important national security tool. But I'm not sure if all of you know this, but there are at least 6 U.S. citizens right now, and I think over 10 permanent residents, who are being forcibly exiled from the United States. What happened is that this is based on publicly available information, and I've just deduced this, is that after the December 25th attempted bombing, these people traveled before that incident. They were stuck on the no-fly, they put on the no-fly list, and now they can't get back home, and there's no redress, because the redress program that's available under DHS is completely dysfunctional, if not futile. So essentially, their citizenship is worthless. If their citizenship is worthless, then our citizenship is worthless. So I'm mentioning this because we shouldn't wait until either each of us end up being forcibly exiled from the United States or some famous person before we care about the fact that the integrity of our citizenship status is being compromised. And finally, I just want to end by mentioning the recent FBI raids of homes and organizations of very prominent and very well-known and very overt advocacy groups such as the Arab American Action Network, which again provides important social services. And this came on the heel. Right afterwards, there was a report by the FBI's DOJ Inspector General where he essentially found that the FBI had been spying on at least 5 groups without any indicia of criminal activity and no basis. So I will end with just, there's so much to talk about. I will end with just in closing to say that I recommend that we just focus on 3 basic principles and we stick to these principles. The first is that we should focus our law enforcement resources on criminal activity, not on popular political and religious speech. I think we all agree, but we have to implement that. And unfortunately, the Inspector General has shown that that's not being implemented. Second, we need to initiate investigatory or prosecutorial powers based on individualized suspicion, not guilt by association, not collective punishment, individualized suspicion. And third, we need to require law enforcement to provide specific and articulable facts showing a probable cause that a crime was committed. Don't go on your hunches. Don't think it's just vaguely relevant. You need to have some specific and articulable facts to show that, in fact, this person is worthy or warrants being investigated. So just as our founding fathers did all in their powers to establish these rights, so should we in preserving them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry to look like the, you know, in the ad when the wildebeest was going after the, well, I guess no, it was the tiger going after the wildebeest. I sometimes feel like that's my role as a moderator. Peter Bergen is up next, and the name of his next book is The Longest War, America and Al-Qaeda Since 9/11. So, proper Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for this invitation. It's great to be on such a distinguished panel. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer. I'm on a panel with one of the leading civil rights attorneys in the United States and also the State Department's lawyer for many years, John Bellinger. So I don't really want to comment so much on the civil rights issues. I want to talk about the threat, because how you assess the threat has great implications about what you do about it legally. If the threat is existential, then extraordinary measures are called for. If the threat is merely problematic, then business as usual. And so let me just briefly sketch out where the threat is, where I think the threat is today, and you can draw your own implications. In a study the New America Foundation has done of all the jihadist terrorist cases since 9/11, there are 172 of them by our calculation. None of them involve a weapon of mass destruction, i.e. no chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons. Thomas Schelling very ably earlier in this session explained why it was so difficult for terrorists to acquire nuclear weapons. Let me add just one other very important point. Highly enriched uranium is a necessary precondition for a nuclear weapon. If you take together every reported account of stolen highly enriched uranium since World War II, you come up with 8 pounds. To build even the simplest type of nuclear device, you need 20 to 25 pounds. Hiroshima, the gun-type nuclear device that was dropped on Hiroshima, was 60 pounds. So, and by the way, all those thefts, none of them are related to Al-Qaeda or affiliated groups. And so there isn't even the material, let alone the expertise for terrorist groups to create these. It's worth remembering that Iran has had a nuclear program for 2 decades and is still some way from a nuclear weapon, despite the fact that they put hundreds of millions of dollars into this. For a terrorist or a group to acquire, buy, or steal a nuclear weapon is simply fanciful. Second point, the threat from Al-Qaeda itself is not existential, obviously. A 9/11 style attack on the United States is enormously improbable at this point. The outer limits of their capability is something like what we saw with the Najibullah Zazi case, a guy who, if he had succeeded, would have probably killed dozens of people on the Manhattan subways in the summer of 2009. A big deal, but not existential, and certainly not something that would change our foreign policy and national security doctrines as 9/11 did. If Flight 253 had blown up over Detroit on Christmas Day, yes, it would have been quite a big deal. 300 Americans dead, a number of them on the ground, global aviation closed down, international business and tourism severely impacted, but not a 9/11 style event either. Some other factors we should be considering. Earlier, one of the panels talked about the number of people in Al-Qaeda, the fact there are very few of them. That is a red herring, the first order. There were only 200 members of Al-Qaeda on 9/11. Small groups of people can do lots of damage. The question is, what kind of damage can they do? And right now, there are limits to what they can do. I think there are some troubling things we must be aware of. I agree with what Professor Aziz was was talking about, in many ways, I mean, the Time magazine cover story this week is very interesting because there was a guy in there, the allegation is against him, he's now dead. His name was Cummings. He had a $2 million trust fund, and he was assembling what was a pretty serious radiological bomb. And he was a right-wing terrorist, not somebody motivated by jihadist ideology. So, yes, indeed, there are right-wing terrorists we should be concerned about. But the fact is that if you look at the cases in 2009, there were 43 cases against American citizens or residents motivated by jihadist ideology, and they are unfortunately Muslim. And that is the largest number of cases that we've seen since 9/11. Another kind of troubling development is the Americanization of the leadership of some of these groups. Shukr Jumrah, who's now the leader of Al-Qaeda's external operations, grew up in Brooklyn and Florida. Omar Hamami, who is effectively one of the leaders of Al-Shabaab, grew up in Alabama, a convert he was a Baptist. You have al-Lawki, of course, the Yemeni cleric, and you have David Headley, who played an absolutely critical role in the surveillance of the targets in Mumbai in 2008. There's also a diversification of the kinds of people joining these groups, when I say these groups in the United States, and there's a diversification of the kinds of groups they're joining. So not just Al-Qaeda Central, as Najibullah Zazi tried to join, but also groups like Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Pakistani Taliban, etc. The good news, there is some good news in this, I think. As a result of the diversification, there's no ethnic profile. I think if you look at the terrorist cases since 2009, and you're going to see that there are a disproportionately large number of Somali Americans because there have been a lot of Somali American cases, but otherwise this is something that cuts across all ethnic groups. You're just as likely to be a 47-year-old divorcee from Pennsylvania as Jihad Jain is, as you are to be an Arab American or an African American or any other ethnic group. Let me now turn just briefly to factors that are working against these groups and factors that are working for them. Factors that are working for them, I think, are quite worrisome. Al-Qaeda is infected ideologically, and this is why the small numbers of people in Al-Qaeda is such a red herring, has infected ideologically other groups that are very large. So Lashkar-e-Taiba when it has an annual gathering in Pakistan, hundreds of thousands of people show up. And this is a group that can draw on tens of thousands of people, and this is a group that is now operating in a much more Al-Qaeda-like manner. When they go out of their way to attack American and Jewish targets in Mumbai, as they did in 2008, that's a change of tactics for these groups, which were previously focused really on Indian targets. Similarly with the Pakistani Taliban, which numbers tens of thousands of people, they sent somebody to Times Square, as you know, Faisal Shahzad, to blow up an SUV there. And another, I think, worrisome part of all this is Al-Qaeda's affiliates. Some of them are, somewhat resilient. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which the obituary of which has been written numerous times, is back with quite some strength now in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is one of the weaker affiliates, but the events in France that we've seen, the arrests and the concerns about an attack was about Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which hitherto has not really shown much ability to attack outside of North Africa. Al-Shabaab has attacked not only in Uganda, but they tried to kill somebody in Denmark, one of the Danish cartoonists who painted the offensive picture of the Prophet Muhammad. Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri are still out there. Pache, some of the things we heard from Jenna Jordan, I think that if you decapitated bin Laden, Al-Qaeda would largely go out of business. When you join Al-Qaeda, you don't join Al-Qaeda, you swear a personal oath to bin Laden himself. This is a very charismatic, driven leadership-type organization. When an affiliate of Al-Qaeda joins Al-Qaeda, they don't swear allegiance to Al-Qaeda, they swear allegiance to bin Laden. So his importance to not only the group, but also the social movement is quite high. And then finally, another thing that operates for these groups is our own overreactions. I mean, if we kind of lose our cool over near misses, as we did on a number of occasions in recent years, this is enormously counterproductive. And of course, terrorist groups understand that. We need to be more resilient as a society and not overreact. Now, factors that are operating against these groups, I think, are important to note. Just four of them, as I sum up. Drone attacks are having some effects on these groups, but they're not certainly a panacea. If you were trying to measure how effective drone attacks would be, one of the things you'd be measuring would be how many Westerners are still showing up for training. Well, it turns out if the European terror alert is accurate, which I think it is that you've had literally dozens of Germans still going to the tribal regions for training, despite the drone attacks. So they don't seem to be having much of a deterrent effect, although they may be reducing the amount of time for training. Faisal Shahzad, for instance, was in the Waziristan for 40 days trying to train for the Times Square attack, but only got 5 days training, which may account for the fact that the bomb didn't actually succeed in blowing up. Another kind of metric you'd be looking at if the drone attacks were so successful is declining violence in Afghanistan and Pakistan. After all, the locus of many of the groups that are doing the violence are in the tribal regions. Well, violence is at stratospheric levels in Pakistan and Afghanistan, relatively speaking, right now. So the drones may have had some interruptive effect, but certainly not a panacea. I think three points that are operating against al-Qaeda that are quite significant. Negative Pakistani attitudes to the militants. There's been a sea change here. This is arguably the most important strategic shift since 9/11. The Taliban enjoyed a sort of religious Robin Hood image. That has just evaporated. Support for suicide bombings dropped from 33% to 5% in the last several years in Pakistan, and you've seen similar drops in support for the Taliban and bin Laden. And that's mirrored by similar kinds of results around the Muslim world. Support for suicide bombing in Indonesia, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all these countries is just cratered. So al-Qaeda and like-minded groups are losing the war of ideas, not because we're winning them, but because they're losing them. It was always very naive to think that we would win them. It's much more important to get your enemy to essentially lose. And that's, as we saw to some degree in the Cold War, was the way that the Soviet Union imploded, because they lost the war of ideas. Al-Qaeda is losing the war of ideas amongst Muslims. And finally, and I think this cannot be underestimated as an important fact, some of the religious clerics and jihadist militants that bin Laden looked to as really sort of people that he looked up to have turned against him publicly. Most prominently, Sheikh Samuel al-Awda, who's a serious Saudi religious figure who's spent years in a Saudi prison, who called for a jihad against the U.S. occupation of Iraq. He has turned against bin Laden publicly. It's one thing that lots of Muslim clerics have condemned 9/11. Lots of them have condemned terrorism. Very few have condemned bin Laden by name. And so al-Qaeda has never responded to that. And I think when al-Qaeda is beginning to lose the serious religious clerics and people that it fought with in the jihad against the Soviet Union, it is seriously losing the war of ideas. One final caveat to that. The Baader-Meinhof gang consisted of maybe a couple of dozen people in 1970s Germany, and was still able to inflict a tremendous amount of damage on German society. And so merely because you're losing popular support doesn't mean it's the end for these kinds of groups.
Thank you so much. Please thank our panel for fascinating tour de force of some of the issues. I want to remind everyone that we are being taped for C-SPAN. We want to welcome our C-SPAN viewers. I wish I could take some questions from all of our viewers in C-SPAN, but we've got folks with questions here, which we'll do. And I'm going to launch just one thing and do two parts. One, I can't let my friend John Bellinger go without responding in some of his thinking, because I admire so much of what you tried to do in the Bush administration about this question of the fog of law. One of your partners and colleagues and friends, Jack Goldsmith, was also part of that effort, and I would say was on, at least from my view of history, on the right side of that battle. But he wrote an op-ed this past week that somewhat disheartened me. It basically said, these tribunals and trying things around here, we just ought to accept the fact that we can detain alleged terrorists indefinitely and just leave them there, and let's not want anything more. And it was a fairly shocking op-ed because, to some degree, for those of you who follow the details of this, this was, whether he was frustrated or not, acquiescing to David Addington's view of justice. And I'm interested in your remarks. And secondly, for Peter and Professor Aziz, I think that there's somewhat of a test that recently happened of some of your notions, and it's a complex one, which is the revelations of a group of folks that have gone to Pakistan and trained to create Mumbai-style attacks throughout Europe. And what came out, and Peter's much more of an expert on this, was a remarkable number of revelations very quickly. And I talked to Fran Townsend, who was a terrorism and Homeland Security advisor to President Bush, about what she had hoped to try to be here today as well and couldn't make it. But she said that it's interesting because the data sharing agreements between Europe and the United States are very, very specific and confined. And while there is certain data sharing about individuals and personalities with regard to travel, there are agreements that that information cannot be shared with the intelligence community, which I found fascinating. I never knew that, if that's in fact true. But she suspected that within this case, because of the fear of the Mumbai-like attacks, that Europe actually did, in fact, allow the sharing of that intelligence with other key intelligence galleries, perhaps on a one-time basis. But she said it raises the interesting question of when you are confronted with crisis, what are the legal mechanisms or not for dealing with these questions, whether you move on an ad hoc basis or you move in a routinized basis. And I'd like both of you to address that, because it does get at the core of agreements on civil liberties and privacy versus the need to basically protect the collective, if you will, from imminent attacks. So, Peter, why don't I, John, start with you with regards to your friend Jack Goldsmith. That's not on.
The question is whether we should try to prosecute the various members of al-Qaeda and the Taliban who we are holding now. And that's been one of the great debates throughout the Bush administration and continues to this day. The individuals who were held all through the Bush administration now continue to be held. There are about 175 in Guantanamo and another several hundred in Afghanistan, are being held under the laws of war, essentially under the customary international law of war, not because they are terror suspects. At the same time, the Bush administration did decide that although we were not required to prosecute them, nonetheless, we did want to try to prosecute certain individuals because they had committed such heinous crimes. The Bush administration decided that they only wanted to do that in military commissions and set up military commissions in a way that, in my view, and ultimately in the view of the Supreme Court, were problematic and had to be redone and re-legislated. The Obama administration, having taken a look at that, everyone expected that they would jettison military commissions altogether, that was just an invention of the Bush administration and an evil thing, and somewhat surprisingly concluded, well, you know, we're going to actually, if we're going to prosecute people, we're going to have to try to prosecute some in federal courts, but some in military commissions, not because military commissions are sort of second-class justice, but because some individuals had committed only war crimes, not crimes that were also federal crimes. Now, that's where we have been for the last year and a half, and which is to try to prosecute some individuals, the 9/11 planners, and others like the Cole bombers in military commissions, but not everyone, only people who had committed crimes. Now, my friend Jack Goldsmith came out with an editorial a couple of days ago in which he threw up his hands and said, 10 years later, we have been unable to prosecute anyone, and it doesn't look like we're going to really get anything off the ground, whether it's military commissions or federal trials. I'm also frustrated. It has been 10 years, and the next trial is not anywhere really close. There is one that's supposed to begin in 10 days for the military commission trial of a young Canadian al-Qaeda member named Cotter. But these are very difficult. I'm not ready to throw in the towel yet, Steve. I think we ought to keep trying. As I said before, I don't swing one way or the other. This gets to the polarization in the country that concerns me, where we have Republicans who continue, as the Bush administration did, to see everything only in military terms. Don't you Democrats understand that we're in a war? Everything should be handled in a warlike manner. Military commissions, hold people under the laws of war. Democrats on the farther left have tried to say the opposite, to say nothing really changed after 9/11. This whole war idea is not right at all. We ought to just try people in federal courts. My view is that the answer continues to lie somewhere in between. It is messy, unfortunately, but the individuals who we have captured outside the United States, many of whom are on a battlefield, do not fit neatly into federal courts. Some of them have not committed federal crimes, but we ought to keep at it. I hope, as I said, after the election, we will get back to trying the 9/11 planners in federal court. Don't throw in the towel, and try to keep the military commissions fair, which I think they will be, and try those individuals who have committed war crimes in military commissions. Which, last point on this, the military commissions are run by the judges and prosecutors and defense counsel who run court-martials. These are the people who do military justice every day, and they are going to run fair trials if they can get up and get started.
Peter.
I wanted to follow up with John and maybe also Professor Aziz to ask them a question that relates to this, because looking at the Gilani trial in New York City right now, the judge has excluded evidence that was obtained by coercive interrogation. If I'm Eric Holder and others in the Obama administration, surely my takeaway from that is no federal courts trials for any of the 9/11 plotters who've been subjected to any kind of coercive interrogations. Wouldn't that be the natural? I'm not saying that's the right conclusion, but wouldn't that be a very understandable conclusion?
It's interesting. I would be very worried about that, and that the judge in the Gilani case did exclude a major piece of evidence, and that would presage, one might believe, if you were to try the 9/11 planners, KSM and others who were apparently waterboarded, that could make those trials very difficult. At the same time, the civil liberties groups, while crowing over that decision, at the same time we're not very happy because the judge at the same time said, but maybe it really doesn't matter because if he's acquitted, you can continue to hold him indefinitely anyway, which seemed to pull the rug out under the whole first part of his holding. That's why I think we need to have a detention law, is if we are going to, in fact, be holding some people indefinitely, particularly if we are not prosecuting them, that there needs to be a more regularized legislation that clarifies who can be held, how long they can be held, and under what review mechanism. And Congress needs to roll up its sleeves and try to attack that difficult problem. But yes, Peter, you're right. I would be, if I were Eric Holder and the administration, I would be worried about that ruling. They say they're going to forge ahead anyway.
Can I just make a quick comment? I think maybe I'll make a radical statement, is let's not torture. Let's find a reason. If this is a good deterrent, let it be that we can't prosecute terrorists, because first of all, we don't even know if that information is credible. That's one of the biggest reasons why torture is something that we don't do. Part of it is a moral reason and a normative reason that it's wrong, but it's also been proven that much of the information that is received from torture is not always credible. And if we're going to allow torture, or we're going to allow the prosecution of people who have been tortured and continue to detain them, yet say we don't torture, then what deterrent do we have? I mean, the whole reason why we don't torture is that, other than the normative reason, is because you can't use that evidence in court, and that's in my opinion, that is a very good deterrent and a very good. If
I may, even though I would love to talk about the Mumbai-style attacks, which we may not be able to because I've got to get to the audience. I would also say that just knowing John and his work at the Council on Foreign Relations, that one of the other issues is not just about the United States issues in this, it's the question of the international legal frameworks of other states that are facing these, that ultimately also have to try this, that one of the problems that Guantanamo and the coercion method did, if you've got individuals that go back to England or go back to a European country, that they are, under their own laws, unable to do this. And John Bellinger, I think more than anyone else, has been talking about the absence of a more robust international set of understandings. I think he would argue that, in part because of his efforts, John has helped create at least some understandings on that. But it's not just the fundamental of U.S. laws. It's that it actually becomes difficult to take action in other in other states. Is that correct, John?
Yes, I mean, one of the problems with Guantanamo overall, and then some of the Bush administration's policies, or that they became so unpopular both in the Muslim world and with our allies, is that at least in the Muslim world, and Peter can speak better to this, I think it ended up raising more Islamic extremists through Guantanamo than detaining the ones who were there. But our allies began to stop cooperating with us. For example, in Afghanistan, we got to the point where if some of our allied forces, the Canadians and Australians, the Brits, the Danes, the Dutch, would capture someone, they would not turn them over to the United States. They would rather turn them over to the Afghans than they would to the United States, because they feared that we would mistreat them. The point, though, on the fog of war, though, the reason it's difficult, I would be a rich man if I had $1 for every time I was told as legal advisor by someone around the world, the fight against terrorism must be conducted in accordance with the rule of law. And I'd say, I agree with you completely. Who can disagree with that? The problem is what precisely are the rules that fit these people? They don't fit neatly in our criminal laws. we cannot send extradition requests to Yemen or to Pakistan or various places and expect them to be complied with. We just don't have a well-functioning international criminal legal system, nor do the Geneva Conventions neatly fit this people. So that's why the Obama administration, if it were that easy, I can tell you the Obama administration's hearts are in the right place. There are a lot of very good people in the administration. If it were that easy, they would have fixed it up within months.
Did you get a phone call from Greg Craig a little bit into his term as White House counsel and say, I get it?
Many people have called to say that they do understand that these issues are difficult.
So forget my other question. I'm going to go to the floor now. Questions, comments? If this gentleman here, if we can get a mic down to him. I'm going to ask for brevity because we just have a few minutes for this panel. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Mike Billington again. Mr. Bellinger, in reference to your discussion of Obama continuing the highly questionable practices of the Bush-Cheney administration, there was serious discussion of impeachment in the Bush-Cheney years. There were those who wanted to bring criminal charges after they left because of those challenges to the Constitution. And, of course, now, as you've said, we have basically all of those practices being continued and even expanded. So I think I would ask you to comment on what you think is the criminal culpability of the Obama administration. Maybe that's why Obama and Pelosi didn't want to try Bush and Cheney when they came in, because they knew they were going to be continuing these practices. But I'd like to know your view and perhaps the others.
Nice, friendly question.
Yeah, all the leading question.
Yeah.
Brief answer if you want to answer.
Let me say two things.
Your microphone.
To try to answer your question directly, I think Obama really had no other choice than to express concern about the policies, to state his disapproval of them, but to try to turn backwards and to conduct investigations and prosecutions, I think, would have torn the country apart. Of course, there are certain things that they are continuing to look at. What I think internationally, as someone who was the legal advisor for the State Department, is going to be interesting is how is the international community going to react to this? Because they really expected wholesale change and have been enormously disappointed. As I would talk to them about this after 6 months and 9 months, they would say, well, we see everything hasn't changed after 6 months, but you've got to give them time. Well, 9 months, it's because people have had a hard time getting confirmed. Well, a year, it takes a long time to turn the aircraft carrier. Well, it's now been almost 2 years, and these policies that were reviled, indefinite detention without trial, renditions, military commissions, are still being continued. And so, what I've said to the international community is, instead of just acquiescing, or instead of just condemning the Obama administration as much as you condemn the Bush administration, let's sit down and have a serious dialogue about some of these difficult issues. Are drone strikes legal or not? These are difficult issues. There are some now that lawsuits against the U.S. government who are suggesting that they violate both international law and the Constitution. I don't believe that, personally. I think they raise policy concerns. You need to certainly make sure you're hitting the right people. But I don't think, as some have suggested, that they are blatant violations of international law. And so I think we need to sit down with our allies and work through some of these difficult legal policies that the Obama administration is continuing to see why they're doing them.
Peter?
John, clarification. I mean, you say renditions are continuing. What do you mean? I mean, my impression is there have been no extraordinary renditions, i.e. taking somebody from country B to country C where they're then tortured, using renditions in the sense of taking somebody from a country that we don't have an extradition treaty with, or how are you using it? And can you point to examples of it being used?
It's a good question, which goes really to the heart of the matter of why we have to have dialogue, is that because of the so-called extraordinary renditions that were apparently conducted by the Bush administration, where someone would be, in fact, moved from country A to country B, where they were apparently then mistreated, the international community overreacted and suggested that it is always illegal to move anybody outside of a normal legal framework of extradition or immigration expulsion. It's this idea that the fight against terrorism has to be conducted in accordance with the rule of law, and it's very easy to say that. The problem, as I said, is we don't have a perfect web of extradition treaties. That's why the Obama administration has come out very quietly and said, well, actually, we are going to continue, at least as a policy matter, the practice of rendition, moving people outside of a normal legal framework, outside the normal bounds of the law, either back to the United States to face justice or even from country A to country B where they can face justice somewhere else. What they have said is, but we will be careful about doing it. We will introduce safeguards. And that's exactly the kind of discussion that I think needs to occur internationally and domestically, or you have these sort of polarized views of either fully illegal or fully legal when there needs to be some discussion in the middle.
Steve, I'm sorry, can I just add one thing? I think when we talk about rule of law, what are we talking about? The right to know what charges are filed against you, the right to meaningfully defend yourself, the right to have counsel, the right to be before a neutral arbiter. So you're right, we need to get into the details depending on what circumstances we're talking about, but for a long time people thought that everybody in Guantanamo was the worst of the worst. And then when we actually went and gave them some process, although there's a dispute as to whether they had enough process, it turns out that half of them were people who were victims of bounty hunters in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so I think that's at least the principle behind the push for the rule of law and against things like secret rendition or anything that's not transparent.
In fairness, though, I think we've moved beyond that. I mean, we can keep fighting those battles. Those are the battles from 8 years ago. The question now, though, is everybody can agree that we should not hold the wrong people. But the question is, should we be holding people at all under the laws of war indefinitely without some sort of a review mechanism? People are going through habeas right now, which is a review mechanism. The Constitution granted them that right. But think about this. Once you've gone through your initial habeas process, say you're 25, and a court has decided, yep, you in fact were the right person, you were a member of al-Qaeda, so you were properly detained, that's it for you. You can then be held indefinitely for the rest of your life. Those are the hard questions. So, I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I just think that we ought to focus not on the questions of 7 years ago, but the difficult questions right now that face the Obama administration.
To conclude this...
Actually, I'd like to follow up with this.
If you can do it in about 10 seconds.
10 seconds. It would be great if Congress sort of did what you're suggesting, John, which is to come up with some legal framework. But they've had 10 years to do it, and they haven't. Is it because they're scared, or is it because... And do you think there would be some unintended consequences of laws that were congressionally authorized that might be much more restrictive to civil liberties than what exists now?
Well, let me respond to that, and I should give the professor the last word because I think I sort of stepped on her line. I think they are. There are two things going on from either extreme. The Democrats, many of them, don't want a new detention law because they do not want to regularize the process of detention. They don't want to have a law that would essentially be preventive detention, that for the first time would have a statute that says that specifically that you can hold people indefinitely without trying them. They would rather continue on this vaporous 2001 statute that doesn't say anything about detention but just says that you can use force against those who planned 9/11 rather than to have any greater clarity. Republicans, on the other hand, don't want to have a statute that might give anyone any greater rights because then it would be rights for terrorists. So as a result, we have absolute gridlock and the administration, which the president had said in his archive speech, we need to have a new legal framework to do this, has thrown up his hands because Congress is caught in gridlock. And this is too serious an issue if we are going to be holding people indefinitely, and particularly if Jack Goldsmith ends up being right and that we cannot try people, we've got to have a clearer legislation.
I very much hope he's wrong. But Sahar, you get the last brief word.
I think we agree as far as there needs to be a process. I personally do not think people should be held indefinitely. I think that they need to go through some process. I would prefer the criminal justice system because I trust it, and I think that there are great safeguards. I realize they may not be practical in every circumstance. But I guess the point that I make is that we don't know if they're terrorism until we give them some due process so that they can defend themselves and we can show our evidence and they can show their evidence. There's already been enough cases to cause concern that we have in fact grabbed people, ruined their lives, put them somewhere out in Cuba for years, and it turned out they haven't done anything. They were farmers. So I know this happened a long time ago, but we can do it again. And so I'm just making a fundamental point that I think we all agree on, is that we have to have some transparency, and we have to have a system, we're going to disagree on which system, that gives them some adequate due process rights.
Thank
you. So we
you.
know we're really terrorists.
Thank you. I saw these great questions out there, and I can't take them yet. But we've got a fantastic next panel, and we have Zalmay Khalilzad, and I promise to come back to you folks and do this. But I want to please help me thank Peter Bergen, John Bellinger, and Sahar Aziz. Thank you very much. And will our next panel come out right away? John.